This is a Sports Catastrophe production.
Hey there, Heather, ho there. It's Jeff Cutter Diving, welcoming you to another sports catastrophe on this day. And on this day, April 17th, 2017, one of the wildest hockey playoff days in history happened as 4 games were played. And all 4 of the 2017 Stanley Cup playoffs ended up going to overtime. Amazing, don't you think? That you could have 4 or more playoff games in one day and then all 4 go in the overtime. So it's the first round of the 2017 playoffs. There will be 4 interesting matchups involved. In the East, Montreal was the top team. In the Atlantic Division with 150 points, shocking a lot of people. They would be facing the New York Rangers, who were the top wildcard team at 102 points. So Montreal won the division. Ottawa and Boston were second and third, meaning that Boston and Ottawa would meet each other. Washington won the Metropolitan Division. Pittsburgh and Columbus were 2-3, meaning that Pittsburgh would host Columbus. The Rangers and Leafs both made it in on the wild card rounds. The Rangers would face the Habs and the Leafs, who squeaked into the playoffs by a point over Tampa, and the Islanders would face Washington. In the Western Conference, Chicago won the Central Division. Minnesota and St. Louis would face each other in the first round. Anaheim won the Pacific Division, with Edmonton now facing San Jose. Calgary and Nashville won playoff positions. Calgary would face Anaheim. Chicago would face Nashville. So you see the narrative. So 4 games went to overtime, as I said. First game that went to overtime was Ottawa Boston. It was game 3. Boston and Ottawa were at 1-1 in, in Ottawa. Boston won in Ottawa in game 1, but then Ottawa won in overtime in game 2. Then game 3 happened. Ottawa started off fast as Erik Karlsson flipped in an impossible 65-foot pass, landing in front of Mike Hoffman, and he managed to score on Tuukka Rask, making it 1-0 Ottawa. Ottawa would add 2 more goals, with Derek Brassard scoring, and then Mike Hoffman scoring on the power play to make it 3-0 Ottawa. And it looked like the Sens were going to take care of business against Boston. Not so fast, as Boston used the rest of the second period to their advantage, as Noah Akari, David Backes, and David Pastrnak scored goals to tie the game at 3. No score in the third period, and then in overtime at 5:43, Kyle Turris passed to Erik Karlsson, who passed to Bobby Ryan, who poofed it into the net on the power play after Riley Nash was caught for roughing. And the Senators had a 4-3, victory, as the Sens would go at 2-1 in that series. Ottawa would win game 4 in Boston 1-0 to take a 3-1 stranglehold. Boston would go to Ottawa and win 3-2. However, Ottawa would win in overtime in game 6, as 4 of the 6 games in the Ottawa Boston series went to overtime, which was amazing. More on that narrative later. Anyway, the second game that went to overtime was Washington Toronto. Washington had won game 1 3-2 in overtime, but Toronto, on a double overtime goal by Kasperi Kapanen, snuck it and won game 2 in Washington. Game 3 was at the Air Canada Centre, where it was do or die for the Leafs. It was their first home playoff game in 4 years. Washington started out fast as Nick Backstrom and Alex Ovechkin put up goals to make it 2-0. But at the end of the first period, Austin Matthews, in his rookie campaign, mind you, scored a goal from Morgan Riley to make it 2-1. Washington would add another in the second period as Evgeny Kuznetsov scored from Marcus Johansson and Justin Williams to make it 3-1. Toronto would score late in the second period as Nazem Kadri Kitchener scored from Leo Komarov. The Leafs then, with less than a minute left in the second period, would score again as Willie Nylander scored from Austin Matthews and Zach Hyman. What a combination that was. And tied it at 3. No goals in the third period. Then in overtime, quickly, as Lars Eller was serving a high sticking penalty. Late in the power play, and with only a minute 37 gone into overtime, Nazem Kadri found Morgan Riley, who found Tyler Bozak, who scored from the left side, beating Braden Holtby and giving the Leafs a 4-3 win and giving them a 2-1 series lead. A lot of people thought that Washington was going to crush Toronto. I myself picked Washington to beat Toronto. I didn't say Washington was going to crush Toronto every game. I was just going to say, well, Washington, to be honest, would probably have Toronto. Washington would beat Toronto in Game 4, 5-4, before winning on home ice in overtime in Game 5 to make it a 2-1 to make it 3-2. And then I think it was Kuznetsov, No, Marcus Johansson scored the goal in Game 6 to sink the Leafs and give Washington their first round playoff victory. A giant victory, to be sure. But looking at the narrative of Washington Toronto, you saw not one, not two, but 5 overtime games. So 5 of the 6 games actually went to overtime between Washington and Toronto, which was like unbelievable. I was like, really? Really? So that tied the 51 Leafs Habs Stanley Cup final and the 2012 Blackhawks Coyotes first round series as having the most overtime games in one series. Meanwhile, Nashville was hoping to do well in Chicago against Chicago. Nashville shocked Chicago in the first 2 games of the first round by actually outscoring Chicago 6-0 in those 2 games. The Blackhawks had a chance to do the same to Nashville later on in the night, and Chicago had a 2-0 lead. Dennis Rasmussen and Patrick Kane scored in the second period to make it 2-0 Blackhawks. In the third period, Philip Forsberg took over, scoring a pair of goals to tie the game. Overtime beckoned, and unlike the other 2 overtime games that I mentioned, it was long. It went to 16:44 of the first overtime period when James Neal passed to Kelly Yarncroc, who passed it to Kevin Fiala, and Fiala scored. And Nashville ends up winning the game 3-2 and to take a 3-0 series lead on the Blackhawks. A lot of people thought Chicago had Nashville dead to rights. I mean, after all, Nashville was a wildcard team, and Chicago did win the division. Nashville, the next night, would win 4-1 and complete a sweep of the Blackhawks. In the meantime, Anaheim and Calgary were to battle each other at the Saddle Dome. The Ducks had taken care of Calgary quite easily, 3-2 in both games 1 and 2. Add to the narrative that Calgary rarely won in Anaheim for the past decade, meant that Calgary was screwed. They got home and were hoping to do something big, and they did. Calgary scored 2 power play goals in the first period, Sean Monahan and Christopher Steek. Anaheim scored a late goal with Nick Ritchie to make it 2-1. Then Calgary scored twice in the second period as Michael Stone and Sam Bennett scored to make it 4-1. So it looked good for Calgary to jump back in the series. But somehow they choked. Shea Theodore scored late in the second period to make it 4-2. Then Nate Thompson at 11:14 made it 4-3 from Lindholm and Perry. And then 4 minutes later, Shea Theodore scored again from Bieksa and Nate Thompson. It was like, what the heck was going on? And then overtime came, and like the 2 early overtime games, this ended early, as a minute and a half was only played in the first overtime period, as Richard Raquel passed to Nate Thompson, who passed to Corey Perry, scoring over Brian Elliott's shoulder as the Flames just choked a 4-1 game lead in the game, and the Ducks now were up 3-0. It didn't help that Anaheim 2 nights later would win the game, series 3-1 in overtime. But that was not the full narrative of the 2017 playoffs. The 2017 playoffs had a massive narrative, as many games did go into overtime. So it was, it was just like, how many games went to overtime? Well, 18, 18 first round games between the 8 playoff series went to overtime. So you kind of got the feeling there was a lot of frivolity. Montreal and New York went to overtime twice, with both teams securing an overtime win. Ottawa won 3 of their 4 first round games against Boston in overtime. Toronto and Washington, as I mentioned, went to overtime 5 times. Pittsburgh and Columbus only went to overtime once. That was game 3. Chicago and Nashville, that was the only time. Well, April 17th was game 3. The only time they went to overtime. Minnesota and St. Louis went to overtime twice, with St. Louis winning both. Anaheim's win over Calgary was the only overtime game in that series. And Edmonton San Jose went to overtime twice, with both teams getting an overtime win. It was huge. You saw 18 games go overtime. Of course, after the first round, the question was, how many overtime games would there be otherwise? Well, the second, third, and fourth rounds had to combine only 9 overtime games. So 2/3 of overtime games in 2017 playoffs were in the first round. Of course, with more games because, every series is best of 7, you have 8 series. I could potentially go to 7 games, making it more likely to see overtime. At the end of the day, there were 27 overtime games in the 2000. Well, there were 27 overtime games in 2017, and people thought, "Oh, that's a record." Actually, no, that is not the record. The record is 28. That would be set in 1993. So it was just basically overtime after overtime after overtime, and we almost had the record. In fact, if one of the Stanley Cup Finals games in 2017 between the Penguins and the Sharks went to overtime, no, the Penguins in Nashville, I think. Penguins in Nashville went to overtime. Then we would have seen a record tied. But no, it wasn't meant to be. But anyway, yeah, overtime heroics. And it was crazy to see 4 games go to overtime out of 4. Anyway, I'm Jeff Diamond. I do.